Hi, and welcome to Red Evony. I am Akayasha. You can call me Aka. So, we are carrying on our discussion with defensive buffs. Previously, we talked about the core things that you need to have when you're putting together your defensive buffs. And I think that was all right. Next, we're going to go through the secondary sources for buffs for your defense. And I call them secondary because you have a lot of discretion on what buffs you get from those particular sources. But before we do that though, okay guys, want to put a quick word in for the Amazon App Store. Now, some of you might know this, but for anyone that doesn't, the App Store is officially ending all third-party services by the 20th of August this year. So, if you have Amazon coins that you have already paid for towards Evony, you need to use those before the 20th of August. Now, if you're someone that uses an Amazon device, don't worry, you will still have access to the App Store and its main features, so you can continue to do your thing on there. Aside from that, of course, there are going to be lots of Evony events running. I'm going to stay on top of that, so you guys make sure you stay on top of it too. And there's going to be a new Evony Discord opening up for us to stay connected. Link to the Discord is down in the description. That's it, guys. Remember the D-date, 20th of August. Okay. Now, before we go into the secondary sources for buffs, as I mentioned, the first thing that we need to talk about is buff priorities. Okay? Which buffs are you prioritizing for your defense? Now, if you ask some people, they'll tell you that when you're building a defense, you need all the buffs you can get. Okay? You need everything. And yes, that is true. However, we know very well that the items that you need to get everything are very scarce. So, because of that, you would have to prioritize which buffs you want to get first with the limited items that you have before the other ones can follow along. Now, when we're doing buff prioritization, there are basically two categories that we do it on. The first one is based on what buffs you already have. Now, let me give you a very good example of this. As I showed in the previous video, my wall general is set up for a mixed lower tiered kind of defense. So I have refines for both ground troops and mounted troops. Okay. Now, because I refined my wall general in this way, I don't have any more space for refines for my range troops and my siege troops. Now, because of this, I decided that when I'm getting buffs from all the other sources, I will prioritize getting range and siege buffs above mounted and ground. That's not to say that I don't still need mounted and ground buffs. I do. But because I have already refined my wall general in a way that significantly buffs my ground and my mounted, I need another way for me to significantly buff my range and my siege. Okay? So that is one way I've set up a buff priority, prioritizing range and siege over mounted and ground from my other sources. If, for example, you had a T1 setup and you had all mounted refines on your wall general, then most likely you might want to prioritize getting range, siege, and ground buffs from your other sources. Okay? So that's prioritization based on what we have. The next prioritization that we need to do is prioritization based on what is good for defense. Now, let me ask you a question. If you had the opportunity to get just one buff, okay? Just one buff. And then they give you the option of siege defense, 10%, or ground HP, 10%. Which do you pick? I'm sure we'll get answers on both sides. That's okay. All right, let me ask you another question. If you had the option of getting mounted defense, 10%, or ground defense, 10%, which do you take? Let me ask you another question. if you had the option of getting siege attack 10% or range HP 10%, which do you take? I think at this point, some of you are starting to realize it now, but there are certain buffs for certain troop types that are more important on defense than others. Okay? Like I said, in the grand scheme of things, we want all buffs. Okay? All buffs will be useful on defense. But because we have limited amount of items to get these buffs, we need to prioritize which ones to get first. Now, I'll skip over all the explanation of why the buffs are important or not, okay? I'll just give you the important buffs for defense for the various troop types. So, for ground, you want to prioritize all the three buffs: attack, defense, and HP. Now, some people will argue that for ground, defense and HP are what is important. Yes, that's true. But from a practical standpoint, ground attack is always important because the ground attack is what ultimately determines whether your ground win or lose. Let me break it down like this. If you have one ground troop with this attack and another ground troop with this attack, if the two of them go against each other, which one is going to win? It's going to be the one with the highest attack. And that is the reason why when you get hit by ground troops, you usually have a situation where all of your top ground troops are dead. Okay? This happens largely because the attack buffs for your troops are less than the attack buffs for the attacker. So when the two ground meet each other, your top ground dies. So because of that, again, for ground troops, you want attack, defense, and HP. For range troops, the priority is very simple. Range attack. Okay? That's the main thing that you want for your range on defense. Range attack. For your mounted troops, the main thing that you want is HP. Mounted HP should be the main priority for your mounted troops on defense. Subsequent to that, you can have defense, okay? You can increase your mounted defense because that will help keep your mounted troops alive. And then subsequent to that again, you want attack for your mounted troops. Then for siege, the main things you want to focus on are attack and HP, okay? Those two. Defense is a lesser priority. So those are the various buffs that you need to focus on for all of the troop types. Now, if you have, let's say, buffs from different troop types like ground HP and range attack, which one do you pick? That will depend on what kind of troops you have and the level of buffs that you already have for each of those ones. So in this case, if you have 3000% ground HP, but you only have 1500 range attack, it makes sense for you to do your range attack. You get what I mean? Okay, if you have any questions or comments about these buff priorities or something is still not clear to you, feel free to drop a comment down below. All right, so we want to go ahead and take a look at these secondary sources for buffs. The first one we're going to talk about is research. Okay, we know research is a big thing for getting buffs on defense. Now, I'm not going to talk too much about research from the academy because the majority of the buffs that you get from the academy work both ways. All right, you can get them on attack and on defense. So academy, just do the research, you're all good. The one I really want to focus on is the military academy. Because in the military academy, there are specific buffs that you can get for defense. So take this one, for example, all right? This is range troops and siege machines HP when attacking. So doing this research is purely attacking buffs that you're going to get from this. If we look at this one here, and you read it to the second part, it says increases range troop and siege machine defense by 50% when defending. Okay? So there are buffs that you get in your military academy that are specifically for attacking, and there are buffs that you get that are specifically for defending. If you're trying to buff up your defense, you need to prioritize getting these defensive buffs. So you see why I say you have a lot of discretion in this one. Because by your discretion, with whatever items, gold, tactic scrolls that you have, you can either choose to do an attacking buff or you can choose to do a defensive buff. You can choose to do for siege or you can choose to do for mounted. Okay? It's all your choice. Yes, like I said, they will tell you that you need to do everything, but you need to have the tactic scrolls and the items to do everything. And until you get to that point, you're going to have to prioritize. So again, for research, for building good defense, make sure you're doing those research that are for defending. And then, of course, based on the buff priorities that you have, whether you're prioritizing siege or range or ground, you do the research according to that. Okay. The next one that I want to talk about, which is also an important one, is your duty generals. You can get a lot of buffs from your duty generals. Okay? A lot of defensive buffs. Now, the duty general that you choose and also the duty general that you choose to develop will largely depend on what your buff priorities are. So, in my case, remember that I said that after I did the refining on my wall general, I wanted to prioritize range and siege buffs from other sources. One thing I did with my duty generals was that I made sure that I prioritized ascending duty generals that gave me range and siege buffs. I prioritized those and did those first before I went and did the ones that gave me ground and mounted. Okay? Now, we look at my general list. You can see that pretty much all my duty generals have been ascended fully. But, of course, it didn't start off that way, right? First, I have to pick one duty general. So I got somebody like Ban Chao, for example. If you look at his stats, okay, mostly range and siege buffs, stuff like that. So I did Ban Chao, did a few of the other duty generals like Guan Ryu, okay, and got those range and siege buffs. Then after that, I did the other ones. And of course, which duty general you choose to develop is purely your choice, okay? So I would advise that you develop them in line with what your buff priorities are. All right, then another place that we really need to look at buffs for defending is in your Spirit Beast seals. Okay? So your Spirit Beast seals is another place where you have a lot of discretion on what buffs you want to go on. The buffs that you choose to focus on, again, will depend on what your buff priorities are. But let me just give you one example here. Okay? We have Haiti, the wolf, here. All right? Now, if you look at my seals, see if you can spot something. Okay? See if you can spot what my main priority was here. So we have this one that is attacking ground troop HP, and the seal level is at level 8 out of 20. All right, so that's that one. We go to the next one. Attacking mounted troop defense, 8 out of 20. Okay, that's cool. We go to the next one. Attacking range attack, 8 out of 20. All right, that's good. We look at the next one. Attacking siege HP, 8 out of 20. All right, that's cool. Then we look at this one. In-city siege HP, 13 out of 20. So, I'll ask you, out of all the buffs that I got from this Spirit Beast seals, which one does it look like I have prioritized getting more of? It would be the in-city siege HP. Okay? And again, this is how you will prioritize getting your defensive buffs from the Spirit Beast seals. All right? You can choose to level up any of them that you want. All right? It's all by your discretion. So if you're trying to build a good defense, you need to use that discretion to make sure that you're getting more in-city buffs. Now, this also applies to the seals, but it also applies to the Spirit Beast Ascension, as I call it here. Okay? So, make sure that you have all of those in mind. Right. Now, the next one that we want to talk about is champions. If you have multiple champions, it's your discretion which champion you work on and at what level. Okay, that's all your choice. Let me give you a very good example. So I've been working on Minerva, all right? And I've gotten her to level 17. Now, if we look at her skills, after level 17, so I get attacking siege machine attack at level 18. All right, but I wanted something that would buff my defense. Okay, I didn't want an attacking buff now. I wanted to buff my defense. So what did I do? Instead of continuing to work on Minerva, I looked through my other champions and then I went all the way back to Elizabeth. Okay, my Elizabeth is currently at level 21. The next skill that I will get from Elizabeth is in-city range and siege defense and HP. So, particularly because I wanted a defensive buff, instead of continuing to work on Minerva, I have switched to Elizabeth. And that's the kind of thing that you're going to need to go through when you're building buffs for your defense. Okay? You need to prioritize which champion you want to work on and at what level. Now, we've talked about these various sources of getting buffs for your defense. But, of course, those are not the only places that you can get buffs for defending. All right? There are a lot of places. But we're not covering all of them in this video. We've only gone through the main ones that I think are core to your defense and where you can exercise the most discretion for getting defending buffs to help build up your defense. If you have any questions or comments about the stuff that we've gone through, please feel free to leave them down below. The next thing that we're going to talk about in this series on building a good defense is going to be debuffs. All right? Debuffs are a very important part of your defense. In my opinion, maybe even more important than buffs. So we're going to take our time and go through how to set up debuffs for a good defense in the next video. That's it for me, guys. Thank you very much. Aka signing out.